Hello, this is Patient X Files, where the rare becomes real. The disease that stole souls. I never told anyone about the letter I found in my grandmother's attic, hidden beneath decades of dust and forgotten memories wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1923. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. My Maria sleeps now for 3 weeks. She opens eyes, but there is nobody home. The doctors, they say nothing. God help us all. That letter changed everything I thought I knew about the past. Because Maria wasn't just sleeping. She was dying from something far worse than death itself. Imagine waking up one morning in 1917. The Great War rages across Europe. Death is everywhere, but at least you understand it. Bullets kill, bombs destroy, gas chokes. These are horrors you can see, fight, comprehend. But then something else arrives. Something that doesn't just kill your body, it steals your soul while leaving you alive. Dr. Heinrich Müller was working the night shift at Vienna General Hospital when she was brought in. April 15th, 1917. Anna Hoffman, 23 years old, beautiful, engaged to be married next month. She'd collapsed on the street corner, muttering about feeling tired, so very tired. "Just let me sleep," she whispered to Heinrich as he examined her. Just for a moment. That moment lasted 6 months. Heinrich had seen everything during the war. Gangrene that ate men alive. Shell shock that turned soldiers into screaming shadows. But Anna was different. She breathed, her heart beat steady and strong. Blood pressure normal, reflexes intact. Yet when Heinrich called her name, shook her shoulders, even pricked her with needles, those beautiful brown eyes would flutter open for a second, stare right through him as if he didn't exist, then close again. "She's in there somewhere," Heinrich wrote in his journal. "I can feel it. But something has built a wall between Anna and the world, and every day that wall grows thicker." Heinrich didn't know it yet, but he was witnessing the birth of an epidemic that would make the Black Death look merciful. Because at least the plague killed you quickly. This disease preferred a slower torture. The first cases appeared like scattered raindrops before a storm. 1 here in Vienna, 2 in Paris, 3 in London. Military censors suppressed the reports. With millions dying in trenches, who cared about a few people falling asleep? But the raindrops became a downpour. By winter 1917, hospitals across Europe overflowed with sleepers. Not the peaceful sleep of fairy tales. These people existed in a twilight world between life and death. Some slept for days, waking only to eat mechanically before collapsing again. Others stayed awake but became living statues, sitting motionless for hours, their faces blank as marble. The worst cases were the children. Little Franz Kreutzer was 7 when it took him. His mother Elizabeth kept a diary that still exists today. Day 12. Franz opened his eyes this morning. I thought, thank God my boy is back. I called his name. He looked right at me and said, "Who are you?" "I am his mother. I carried him in my womb. I taught him to walk. But in his eyes, I was a stranger." Day 18. Franz stopped speaking. Day 25. He stopped recognizing food. Day 33. My son died today, though his body breathed still. The disease had no mercy, no logic, no pattern anyone could understand. It struck the wealthy banker in his mansion and the beggar on the street with equal cruelty. Newborn babies and 90-year-old grandmothers. Soldiers who'd survived Verdun and women who'd never left their villages. The healthy and the sick. The faithful and the atheists. Death at least was honest about its intentions. Dr. Konstantin von Economo was working in Vienna when he first understood what they were facing. Not just a disease, but something that seemed to target the very essence of human consciousness. He coined the term Encephalitis Lethargica, sleeping sickness. But those clinical words couldn't capture the horror. It's as if, he wrote to a colleague, something reaches into the brain and switches off the light of the soul, leaving the machinery running but empty. The symptoms followed a cruel pattern. First came what seemed like ordinary flu, fever, chills, body aches. Patients and doctors alike breathed sighs of relief. Just the flu. We can handle flu. Then the drowsiness arrived. Not the gentle tiredness after a long day. This was an overwhelming, irresistible force that pulled people into sleep against their will. They'd fall asleep standing up while eating in the middle of conversations. Their families would shake them awake, and for a moment, just a moment, they'd be present. Then their eyes would close again as if some invisible hand was pressing down their eyelids. The acute phase lasted about 3 months. 1/3 of patients died during this time, slipping from sleep into death so gradually that doctors couldn't pinpoint the exact moment the transition occurred. But death might have been the mercy. Those who survived often wish they hadn't. Margaret Thompson was 28 when the disease found her in London, 1919. A secretary at a law firm engaged to a kind man named William who brought her flowers every Friday. She contracted the sleeping sickness in March. William visited every day during her 3-month ordeal. He held her hand while she slept, read her favorite poems aloud, brought fresh flowers to replace the wilted ones. When Margaret finally opened her eyes and stayed awake, William cried with joy. "And my darling," he whispered, "you're back." But Margaret stared at him with the expression of someone looking at a complete stranger. She didn't speak for 6 months. When words finally came, they were flat, emotionless, as if spoken by a machine learning human speech. "William canceled our engagement last week," Margaret's sister wrote to a friend. "He said it was like being engaged to a photograph of someone who used to exist." Margaret lived another 40 years. She never smiled again, never cried, never showed anger or joy or fear. She went through the motions of life like an actress who'd forgotten her lines but continued performing anyway. The newspapers called them ghost people, souls trapped in working bodies. By 1918, the disease had crossed every border, ignored every quarantine, infected every continent. The exact numbers will never be known. War, revolution, and chaos made accurate record-keeping impossible. But conservative estimates suggest at least 5 million people contracted encephalitis lethargica. Compare that to the total military deaths of World War I. The sleeping sickness claimed nearly as many victims as the entire Great War. Russia suffered particularly badly. The revolution had shattered the medical system. Many doctors had fled or been killed. Those who remained were overwhelmed by typhus, cholera, and famine. When the sleeping sickness arrived, it found a population already pushed to the breaking point. Dr. Alexander Gaimanovich in Kharkov was among the first Russian physicians to recognize the disease. His reports paint a picture of absolute helplessness. "We have no treatment, no understanding, no hope to offer families. We can only watch as this plague steals the humanity from our patients while leaving their bodies intact." The disease seemed to mock every advance of modern medicine. Microscopes revealed nothing. Blood tests showed no abnormalities. Autopsies of the dead provided few clues. It was as if the disease operated on a level science couldn't reach. Some doctors cracked under the pressure. Dr. James Morrison in Edinburgh was found in his office one morning in 1920, surrounded by files of sleeping sickness patients. He'd written the same phrase over and over on his desk blotter. Where do they go? Where do they go? Where do they go? He'd suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Religious leaders struggled to explain the epidemic. Was it divine punishment? A test of faith? Why would God inflict such specific, targeted suffering on the innocent? Some churches split over theological interpretations of the disease. Rabbi Samuel Cohen in Warsaw wrote in 1921, "I have seen evil in this world, pogroms, war, hunger. But those horrors attack the body. This attacks something deeper. It makes me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of the human soul." Parents faced impossible choices. Keep catatonic children at home, watching them waste away. Commit them to overcrowded institutions where they'd be forgotten. Some families simply couldn't bear it. The diary of Friedrich Weber, a baker in Berlin, records his agony. "My daughter Greta has been gone for 8 months now. Her body sits in the kitchen chair where she used to laugh and tell me about school. But Greta left us. I don't know what occupies her body now, but it is not my child. Sometimes I catch myself wishing she had died instead. God forgive me for such thoughts." Desperate families tried everything. Religious ceremonies, folk remedies, experimental treatments that bordered on torture. Electrical shocks to stimulate the brain. Ice baths to shock patients into consciousness. Exotic drugs imported from distant countries. Nothing worked. The disease seemed to have its own intelligence, always staying one step ahead of medical understanding. When doctors thought they'd identified a pattern, it changed. When they developed a theory, exceptions emerged. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell in Boston documented over 300 cases between 1918 and 1925. Her notes reveal increasing desperation. Case 127. Patient shows sign of recovery after 2 months catatonia, begins speaking normally, recognizes family. 3 days later, relapses into deeper coma than before. Case 203. Young man recovers completely, returns to work, marries his fiancée. 2 years later, found in his garden, standing motionless for 6 hours, staring at nothing. Condition progresses rapidly to full catatonia. The disease played cruel games with hope. Some patients experienced brief moments of clarity, like drowning people briefly surfacing before sinking again. During these episodes, they'd sometimes speak about their experiences. "It's like being buried alive in your own mind," one patient told Dr. von Economo. "You can hear everything, understand everything, but you can't respond. And slowly, even caring becomes too exhausting." Another described it as watching your life through thick glass, knowing you should feel something but unable to connect with any emotion. The most disturbing accounts came from patients who claimed they could see other victims of the disease during their catatonic states. They described a gray, empty place where the sleeping sickness sufferers wandered, recognizing each other but unable to find their way back to the waking world. Medical journals dismissed these reports as hallucinations, but the consistency of the descriptions across different countries and languages was unsettling. By 1920, the epidemic had created its own infrastructure of horror. Special wards for the sleepers. Training programs for nurses who specialized in caring for the unresponsive. Support groups for families dealing with the living death of their loved ones. The economic impact was staggering. These weren't just sick people who might recover, they were permanent dependents requiring constant care. Families bankrupted themselves maintaining relatives who might never return. Insurance companies initially refused to pay claims, arguing the patients weren't technically dead. Legal battles raged over whether someone in a persistent catatonic state could be declared legally deceased. Marriage laws changed. If your spouse contracted sleeping sickness and became permanently unresponsive, were you still married? Could you remarry? Different countries developed different answers, creating a patchwork of legislation that often separated families. Children grew up in homes haunted by parents who were physically present but emotionally absent. Many developed psychological problems of their own, unable to understand why mommy or daddy wouldn't talk or play anymore. The disease created its own vocabulary of despair. Ghost walking, the mechanical movements of recovered patients. Soul sleep, the deep catatonia from which few returned. The gray time, the period when families still hoped for recovery. And then, as mysteriously as it had appeared, the epidemic began to fade. The last major outbreak occurred in 1925. Case numbers dropped dramatically in 1926. By 1927, new infections had become rare. The sleeping sickness didn't gradually decline or respond to medical intervention. It simply stopped. Dr. Harrison Mills at Johns Hopkins wrote in bewilderment, "It's as if the disease grew bored with humanity and moved on to other pursuits. After a decade of terrorizing the world, it packed its bags and left without explanation. The sudden disappearance was almost as frightening as the epidemic itself. What force could create such widespread suffering and then withdraw without warning? If it could vanish so completely, could it return just as suddenly?" The survivors didn't celebrate. They couldn't. Those who'd recovered from the acute phase remained forever changed. The ghost people continued their empty existence in hospitals and homes around the world. Families still grieved for relatives who breathed but would never truly live again. Medical science was left with more questions than answers. What had caused the epidemic? Why had it targeted the brain's consciousness centers so specifically? How had it spread so efficiently yet selectively? Why had it stopped? Various theories emerged over the decades. Some researchers connected it to the 1918 flu pandemic, suggesting the influenza virus had somehow triggered an autoimmune response that attacked the brain. Others proposed a bacterial cause, pointing to evidence of streptococcal infections in some patients. In the 1990s, British researchers discovered antibodies in some survivors that suggested their immune systems had turned against their own brain tissue. This led to the theory that sleeping sickness was an autoimmune disorder triggered by an infection. The most recent research, conducted in 2012, examined preserved brain tissue from epidemic victims. Researchers found evidence of enterovirus infection, the same family of viruses that causes polio. But why these common viruses would suddenly cause such devastating neurological effects remained unclear. None of the theories fully explained the epidemic's sudden appearance, specific symptoms, and equally sudden disappearance. The sleeping sickness left scars that lasted generations. Families carried the trauma in their stories, their silences, their fears. Children who'd watched parents disappear into catatonia grew up with deep anxieties about mental illness and loss of control. The medical profession was humbled. The epidemic demonstrated how little doctors understood about consciousness, the mind-body connection, and the fragile nature of human awareness. It sparked new research into neurology and psychiatry that continues today. The disease also revealed humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Some families abandoned afflicted relatives to institutions and never visited again. Others devoted their entire lives to caring for loved ones who might never recognize their sacrifice. During the worst years, communities created informal support networks. Neighbors took turns sitting with catatonic patients so exhausted family members could rest. Churches organized fundraisers for families bankrupted by medical costs. Teachers volunteered to educate children whose parents were too overwhelmed to maintain normal routines. The epidemic showed that even in the face of inexplicable suffering, people could choose kindness, but it also revealed darker truths. Some governments saw the disease as an opportunity to rid themselves of undesirable populations. Homeless people, political dissidents, and ethnic minorities who contracted sleeping sickness often received inferior care or were simply forgotten. Medical ethicists today still debate cases from the epidemic. When patients existed in permanent catatonic states, consuming resources but contributing nothing, what obligations did society have to maintain their care? The questions weren't academic. Families faced these decisions daily. The sleeping sickness challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and what makes us human. If someone's body survived but their personality, memories, and ability to connect with others disappeared, had that person died? Were the ghost people still the same individuals their families had loved? Philosophy struggled with these questions as much as medicine. Religious leaders found their faith tested by parishioners asking why God would create such specific, targeted suffering. The disease seemed designed to cause maximum psychological pain to both victims and their families. It was too precise, too cruel to be random. Some saw it as evidence that humans were nothing more than biological machines, complex but ultimately fragile. Others found in the epidemic proof of the soul's existence, arguing that only the departure of something essential could explain such complete personality changes in otherwise healthy bodies. Artists and writers drew inspiration from the tragedy. The image of the living dead, trapped between worlds, appeared in literature and paintings throughout the 1920s and 30s. The epidemic influenced the emerging zombie mythology and popular culture. But for the families who lived through it, there was nothing metaphorical about the horror. Sarah Mitchell kept a photograph on her mantle until she died in 1967. It showed her brother Thomas as he'd been before the disease, laughing, vital, full of plans for the future. Thomas lived until 1952, 27 years after contracting sleeping sickness. But Sarah always said he died in 1925 when the disease took his spirit. The hardest part, she told her daughter, was grieving someone who was still physically present. You couldn't move on because they were right there, breathing, existing. But you couldn't connect because the person you'd loved was gone. Medical historians estimate that by 1930 there were still over 1 million sleeping sickness survivors worldwide living in various stages of post-epidemic disability. Some required total care. Others functioned at basic levels but remained emotionally flat, socially disconnected, unable to experience normal human relationships. They lived in a world that had moved on from their tragedy. The war was over. Prosperity returned. People wanted to forget the horrors of the past decade. But the ghost people remained, silent witnesses to an inexplicable catastrophe. Many families kept their afflicted relatives hidden, ashamed of their condition. Mental illness carried enormous stigma in the early 20th century. Having a family member who stared blankly and moved like a robot was seen as a mark of genetic weakness or divine punishment. The children of sleeping sickness families often grew up with deep psychological scars. They'd learned that the people you loved most could disappear without warning, leaving behind empty shells that looked familiar but felt alien. This created lasting trust issues and anxiety disorders that affected multiple generations. Dr. Margaret Phillips conducted one of the first long-term studies of epidemic families in 1945. She found significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and relationship problems among the children and grandchildren of sleeping sickness victims. The disease didn't just take individuals, she wrote. It wounded entire family trees. Some survivors of the acute disease experienced delayed relapses decades later. A person who'd recovered completely in 1920 might suddenly develop Parkinson's-like symptoms in 1960, as if the disease had gone dormant and then reawakened. This delayed progression terrified the medical community. How long could the sleeping sickness remain hidden in the human nervous system? Were there time bombs ticking in the brains of survivors waiting to explode years or decades later? The most famous delayed cases were documented by Dr. Oliver Sacks in his book, Awakenings. In the 1960s, he treated sleeping sickness survivors who'd been catatonic for 40 years. Using the new drug L-Dopa, he was able to temporarily awaken some patients. But the awakenings were brief and often tragic. Patients woke to find that decades had passed, that everyone they'd known was dead or gone, that the world had changed beyond recognition. Many begged to return to their catatonic state rather than face such devastating loss. The sleeping sickness had stolen not just consciousness, but time itself. Modern medicine has learned much from the epidemic. Research into autoimmune disorders, viral neurology, and consciousness studies all trace their roots to questions raised by the sleeping sickness. The disease taught doctors to look beyond obvious symptoms and consider the complex interactions between immune system, brain function, and psychological well-being. But the central mystery remains unsolved. What caused 5 million people to simultaneously lose their essential humanity? Why did it happen when it did? And most frightening of all, could it happen again? Sporadic cases of encephalitis lethargica still appear occasionally. A few cases per year in various countries, never enough to constitute an epidemic. But each case raises the question, is this the beginning of something larger, or just an echo of past tragedy? Modern surveillance systems would detect a new epidemic much faster than the chaos of 1917 to 1925 allowed. But would early detection matter if medicine still has no effective treatment? Recent research into autoimmune disorders triggered by common infections suggests that something similar to the sleeping sickness could theoretically emerge again. A mutation in a common virus combined with specific environmental or genetic factors might create the perfect storm of neurological devastation. The thought keeps epidemiologists awake at night. In 2009, several children in upstate New York developed symptoms remarkably similar to sleeping sickness after what appeared to be routine strep infections. They became catatonic, unresponsive, trapped in their own minds. Panic spread through the medical community. Fortunately, early intervention with immunosuppressive drugs helped most of the children recover. but the episode served as a chilling reminder that the mechanisms which created the sleeping sickness epidemic still exist in the human immune system. We are not safe from our own biology. The families touched by the original epidemic carried their stories forward through generations. Many kept detailed records, photographs, medical documents, creating an archive of one of medicine's greatest mysteries. These family histories reveal the true cost of the epidemic. Not just the deaths and disabilities, but the ripple effects that continued for decades. Broken marriages, financial ruin, children who grew up too fast, dreams deferred and abandoned. In some ways, everyone alive today carries traces of the sleeping sickness in their family trees. The epidemic was so widespread that virtually every family in the affected regions had some connection to it. A great aunt who never recovered. A neighbor who became a ghost person. A doctor who broke under the strain of helplessness. The epidemic changed how we think about consciousness, identity, and the fragile nature of human existence. It demonstrated that what we consider our essential self, our personalities, our connections to others, our ability to experience emotion, can be taken away while leaving everything else intact. This lesson resonates in modern discussions about dementia, persistent vegetative states, and severe mental illness. The sleeping sickness was perhaps the first disease to specifically target human consciousness while leaving the body largely unharmed. It showed us that there are fates worse than death, but the epidemic also revealed the strength of human love and dedication. Families who spent decades caring for unresponsive relatives. Medical professionals who continued searching for answers despite repeated failures. Communities that supported each other through inexplicable suffering. The sleeping sickness tested humanity and found both cruelty and compassion, both despair and resilience. Today, as we face new pandemics and unknown diseases, the lessons of the sleeping sickness remain relevant. It reminds us that medical science, for all its advances, still has vast gaps in understanding. That diseases can appear suddenly, devastate millions, and disappear without explanation. It challenges us to maintain humility in the face of biological mysteries and to remember that behind every medical statistic are individual human stories of loss, love, and endurance. The sleeping sickness epidemic ended nearly a century ago, but its ghosts still walk among us in the memories of families, the cautious words of epidemiologists, and the ongoing search for answers to one of medicine's most haunting mysteries. Somewhere in the vast complexity of human biology, the mechanisms that created the sleeping sickness wait in dormancy. Like seeds buried in winter soil, they could germinate again under the right conditions. The question isn't whether such an epidemic could happen again. The question is whether we'll be ready when it does. In the quiet corners of medical libraries, researchers still pore over records from the sleeping sickness years. They search for patterns, clues, anything that might prevent future catastrophes. Because they know that the disease that stole souls didn't disappear forever. It's just sleeping, and like its victims, it might wake up at any time. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel. Like, share, and subscribe. Please write a comment what you think about this video.